Before we begin, I'd like to pose a question. Does anyone know the difference between a cruise ship and an ocean liner? Yes, sir.
Ocean liners are for travel specifically. Cruise ships are for enjoyment.
Exactly. Yes. The answer was that a cruise ship really embarks on a pleasure voyage for its passengers, whereas an ocean liner has a very specific purpose to transport its passengers from point A to point B on a lined voyage, hence the name liner. So tonight we're going to be focusing on the liners of the North Atlantic because those are the most memorable, the most well-known. And the North Atlantic route was the most lucrative, prestigious, and some would actually say it's the most dangerous ocean route in the world. So trying to pick a beginning point of the golden age of ocean liners can be somewhat arbitrary, but I chose 1897 for two reasons. One, an audacious stunt, and two, it marked the debut of the first true superliner. 1897 was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and as part of the celebration, the British Admiralty put on a naval review at Spithead, and they assembled an impressive array of merchant ships and warships, when suddenly this slender yacht belching smoke and fire just appeared out of nowhere, weaving in and out the flotilla at the astonishing speed of 34 knots. Even the naval picket dispatched to intercept her couldn't catch up. This was Charles Parsons' Turbinia, and it was a brazen exhibition of the potential of his newly developed steam turbine engine. 1897 also saw the introduction of Norddeutscher Lloyd's innovative Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. This was the first four-funneled ship on the Atlantic, and you'll notice that her funnels are arranged in two pairs separated by open deck. She combined size, speed, power, and comfort. Since acceding to the throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to challenge Britain's economic, political, military, and maritime supremacy, and the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse was the first step in doing that. She captured the mythical blue ribbon for the fastest transatlantic crossing and soon captivated the imagination of the ocean-going public. Over the next 10 years, Norddeutscher Lloyd presented three more ships: the Kronprinz Wilhelm, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the Kronprinzessin Cecily. Kaiser Wilhelm II also held the blue ribbon, taking it from the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. The Hamburg America line, which was Norddeutscher Lloyd's main German liner, rival, under the direction of its 31-year-old manager, Albert Ballin, wanted to compete for the speed sweepstakes itself. And so they introduced in 1900 the Deutschland. Deutschland was fast. She did capture the blue ribbon, but she was plagued by such severe vibration that it affected the comfort of her passengers and actually impacted her structural integrity. So those factors, combined with the high cost of operating her, forced Hapag to withdraw her from service in 1906 and convert her to luxury cruising. However, one legacy was that she introduced the first extra tariff restaurant for first-class passengers, meaning that first-class passengers had an option at extra cost for another dining venue rather than the main dining room, which was included in the fare. Around the turn of the century, the American financier J.P. Morgan assembled an array of shipping lines under the banner of International Mercantile Marine. He acquired Belgian lines, Dutch lines, American lines, and several smaller British lines. But in 1902, he acquired the crown jewel of IMM, Britain's White Star Line, which was the most profitable line on the Atlantic at the time, and second in prestige only to her British rival, Cunard. Now, while Norddeutscher Lloyd and Hapag were nominally independent, IMM held significant minority financial stake, which meant that only France's French line and Britain's Cunard line remained free of Morgan's influence. So, coupled with Germany's maritime ascendancy, the threat of a hostile takeover by an American interest, and looming tensions on the continent, the British government was determined to keep Cunard in British hands. And so they agreed with Cunard to subsidize the construction of 2 superliners, with the provision that they be built to Admiralty standards so that they could be converted to armed merchant cruisers if needed in time of war. The Lusitania was the first, and the contracts for both of these ships were signed in 1905, and Cunard took the bold step of deciding to outfit them with Charles Parsons' turbine engines, only 8 years after Spithead. Lusitania was built in Scotland. She was 80 feet longer than her nearest German rival, and she made her maiden voyage in September of 1907. It took until October for her to take the blue ribbon, but she did capture it from the Deutschland for the westbound record and the Kaiser Wilhelm II for the eastbound record. Over the course of her life, she would eventually achieve a speed of close to 26 knots. Her record-breaking crossing was the first time that the Atlantic had been traversed in less than 4 days. And you'll notice here that this is the greatest technological achievement at the time met at a pier by horse and buggy. The Mauretania, her sister, was British-built, and she made her maiden voyage in November of 1907. She took the eastbound record and would hold on to it for the next 22 years. It would take until 1909 for her to get the westbound record, but once she had it, she was the fastest ocean liner on the Atlantic. To say that her upper decks were cluttered would be a bit of an understatement, thanks mainly to these giant cowled ventilators. And they were a distinguishing feature between her and the Lusitania, which had flat-topped ventilators and gave her a much more streamlined yacht-like look. But I really like this picture because it's able to show in a single frame all 4 funnels, or at least portions of them. It's also notable that it was taken by a young boy named Walter Lord, who would later achieve fame as the author of the book about the sinking of the Titanic, A Night to Remember. With the success of the 2 Cunard Speed Queens, the other lines decided that they were going to forgo the speed sweepstakes and instead focus on comfort and luxury. And in fact, their promotional brochures began to extol the virtues of the 7 or the 9-day ship. So White Star's answer to Cunard was to be a trio of ships that would be the largest and most comfortable in the world. The first was the Olympic. Again, a 4-funneled liner, 4-funneled ship, yes. But the last funnel was actually a dummy funnel. It served as ventilation for the kitchen. Now, while we often look at these liners and we're fascinated by the luxury of their first-class appointments, the true fact of the matter is that the economic engine that really drove these was the immigrant trade. And to the unsophisticated traveler, the number of funnels a ship had indicated safety and reliability. So, if you had to resort to a little bit of sleight of hand and subterfuge to keep up the illusion, that's what you did. The second of the trio, her sister ship, needs no introduction. The Titanic is probably the most famous ocean liner of all time. And she was the largest ship in the world at the time of her maiden voyage, which was tragically cut short when she collided with an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic on the night of April 14th and 15th, 1912, with a loss of over 1,500 souls. Making her debut a mere 6 days after the Titanic, it would appear that French Lines France debuted under a very dark cloud indeed. However, her magnificent decor and her wonderful cuisine earned her the nickname of the Chateau of the Atlantic. She wasn't the largest, and she wasn't the fastest, although she could maintain a respectable 24 knots. She was actually a favorite among first and immigrant class passengers, despite the fact that she was a notorious roller. In 1913, Albert Ballin again was determined to make Hapag the preeminent line, and he introduced a trio of ships often referred to as Ballin's Big Three. These were the first ships to exceed 900 feet and 50,000 gross tons. The first was the Imperator. Sumptuously appointed, lots of marble, made her top heavy, and earned her the nickname Limperata. The second was the Vaterland, and the third proposed ship was the Bismarck. She was launched in 1914, but was laid up during World War I and would never sail under a German flag. The last of the Atlantic four-funnel liners was Cunard's Aquitania. Making her debut in 1914, she was known as the Ship Beautiful. She was able to finally achieve Cunard's dream of a three-ship weekly service between the Old World and the New World. And she would go on to have a long and industrious career that would span both world wars. So, up until now, we've introduced the first great ships from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But we have to keep in mind these were not just impersonal floating box girders. And I say box girder because naval architects simplify their analyses of ships by looking at them as girders. But these ships had a vibrancy and a life of their own. So with the guns of August on the horizon, why don't we take a step back and look at the evolution of their design and decor and maybe even get an idea of what life was like on board. During the days of sail and the early days of steam, an ocean voyage was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. However, as naval architecture advanced, ship stability and reliability greatly enhanced the voyage experience. But ship owners were still very keen to make passengers forget that they were at sea. So they imported into the design of these ships the great period styles like Georgian, Jacobean, Louis XIV, Louis XV, that mimicked the great hotels, the great mansions, such as what we have here at the McFaddin-Ward house, and even great railway stations. And Johannes Popp was a Bremen architect who was considered the innovator that brought this luxury to sea. And here we can see his Beaux Arts sensibilities in the design of the dining room on the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosser. However, notice the long dormitory-style tables and the swivel chairs that were actually bolted to the deck. Apparently, he wasn't as convinced in advances in stability as the architects were. Here you even see more ornate decorative style on the Kaiser Wilhelm II with a dining room that extended up through 3 decks and a glass dome that allowed diffused light into the room. This is the main entrance hall on the Deutschland. And on the Deutschland, here are passengers getting ready, first-class passengers getting ready for dinner. As they were in familiar surroundings, so came familiar customs, such as dressing for dinner, except on the first and last nights of the voyage. This is a smoking room on the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosser. And smoking rooms on these ships at the time were exclusively male preserves. And you can see that it betrays a little bit of Teutonic stuffiness with a design mimicking a German inn, as opposed to the smoking room on the France, which was more comfortable, more open, and less claustrophobic. And regardless of what you call them, lady salons, drawing rooms, reading, writing rooms, these are the kinds of rooms that female passengers were exiled after dinner while the men enjoyed brandy and cigars in the smoking room. The Louis XVI style of the Lusitania's first-class dining room is one of the prettiest dining rooms on ships of the time. You can notice that there are smaller tables, still with the swivel chairs, and this mezzanine up here was at first going to be an extra tariff restaurant. But Cunard didn't like the idea of a special class of first class, so instead it just became an extension of the first class restaurant. And you can see that it's much more cozy, smaller tables, more intimate, and much like what you would see in a grand hotel. This is the aft main staircase on the Titanic, and it gives you an idea of the grandeur of the wood paneling, the wood carving, the statuary, and the ironwork on the railings. Both she and the Olympic also boasted veranda courts, squash courts, swimming baths, and a Turkish bath, not to mention comfy cabins. Charles Mevis was an Alsatian architect who had designed both the London and the Ritz, the London and the Paris Ritz hotels. And he so impressed Albert Ballin that he became the semi-official designer of the big three. And it was really kind of the first time that someone had full reign to design a ship. So there was an integrated whole about it rather than just a random hodgepodge of period rooms dropped here and there, even though he still looked at a traditional style. But that kind of philosophy extended well into the 1930s. And here you can see his winter garden leading into the Ritz restaurant on the Imperata. His design partner, Arthur Davis, was commissioned by Cunard to design the Aquitania. And this room, the Palladian Lounge, is often considered the most beautiful room ever to put to sea. And if you notice this painting up here, that was taken from a Georgian manor and installed intact on the ceiling. The French may not have introduced the idea of a staircase entering a dining room, but they certainly elevated the art of the grand descent. There, female passengers in their finest gowns could pause on the landing, ostensibly to look for their table, while everyone else in the room had their eyes fixed on her while she floated down the stairs on the arm of her companion, who most assuredly was telling her she was the most beautiful woman in the room. Albert Ballin had cut his teeth on the immigrant trade, and so he wanted to make sure that immigrants had as comfortable an experience crossing the ocean as they could. And that philosophy transferred to other lines as well. So this is a third-class restaurant on the Lusitania, not elegant like the first class, but certainly serviceable and comfortable. This is the third-class general room on the Titanic. And while it may seem somewhat Spartan, it's important to remember that the accommodations and the food on these ships, in a lot of cases, was far superior to what many of these immigrants had ever known in their old countries back home. As World War I broke out, German liners on this side of the Atlantic tried to make it back to Britain, or tried to make it back home to Germany. But the British blockade on the eastern seaboard meant that some of them were stranded, like these four, who were tied up in the Chesapeake Bay. This is the Crown Princess and Cecily, and this is the Kaiser Wilhelm II. These liners were immediately put into service as hospital ships, some as armed merchant cruisers, but mostly as troop ships. And this is the Olympic in her dazzle-painted camouflage, which was designed to confuse targeting by German U-boats, and the Mauritania in her dazzle paint. The Lusitania was the only major liner left for regular transatlantic passage. And on May 7th, 1915, as she was approaching the old head of Kinsale in the Irish Sea on the way to Liverpool, she was torpedoed by a German U-boat. She sank in 18 minutes with the loss of over 1,100 lives. And there is still some controversy surrounding the details of her sinking, but this act galvanized international outrage against Imperial Germany. The Britannic was the last of the proposed White Star trio. She never made a commercial voyage. She was immediately requisitioned as a hospital ship, and in November of 1916, she struck a mine in the Aegean Sea. Only 30 people lost their lives, and remarkably, over 1,100 were saved, many of them wounded soldiers. The interwar years brought a lot of changes. These were some of the most memorable and famous liners that we know today. There were advances in technology. There were advances in interior decoration. But it was also a time of social change. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 drastically reduced immigrant passage to America, and so the ship lines had to come up with some way of making up for that lost revenue. Thus was born the idea of tourist third class, which would allow students, teachers, clergymen, and other people of modest means a budget way of traveling back and forth to Europe. But first, there were war reparations. The Imperator was awarded to Cunard for the loss of the Lusitania and became the Berengaria. The Bismarck was awarded to White Star for the loss of the Britannic and became the Majestic. The Vaterland was interned in Hoboken, New Jersey, and converted to a troop ship for the U.S. war effort, and then was reconverted to passenger service as the Leviathan. And she's probably the most famous ship that nobody's ever heard of. She even has a 6-volume biography written about her. Now, the Paris was launched in 1916, sat out the war, and made her debut in 1921 as sort of a bridge between the Belle Epoque and Art Nouveau. Here you can see a distinct Moroccan flavor to her entrance hall that really is not reflective in any way of period revivalism. And if the Paris was a tentative foray into modern design, then the Ile-de-France was a full-fledged revolution. She employed Art Deco design, and the French line had adopted the slogan, "the longest gangplank in the world." And they admonished her designers that this ship was to be a creation and not a reflection of the past. And she was a creation. She introduced interiors that had been unimaginable before, and soon became the ship of choice among discerning clientele. Of course, the French line's reputation for cuisine didn't hurt. It was often said that more seagulls followed French line ships than any other. However, her post-World War refit diminished a lot of her initial panache, as you can see in the conversion of her dining room, as well as pre- and post-war versions of her main entrance hall. It even cost her one of her funnels. And she met a rather ignominious end. She was sold to Japanese shipbreakers, and they decided they could get an extra buck out of her by leasing her to Hollywood as a prop for the movie The Last Voyage with Robert Stack and Dorothy Malone. And despite the fact that for an ocean liner historian, the movie shows some really spectacular footage of her open decks and her interiors. For the non-historian, if you see it on TCM, my advice is don't bother. The French line was outraged that this happened, and so future contracts with any shipbreakers specified she was only to be sold for scrap and nothing else. Emerging from the humiliation of World War II, or World War I rather, Germany was determined in the 1920s to reestablish maritime supremacy and recapture the Blue Ribbon. And thus the first true ships of state, the Bremen and the Europa, came on the scene. And with their squat funnels, curved forward superstructure, they suggested aggressive power and speed. However, those squat funnels were not enough to dissipate soot and smoke away from the decks and consequently on passengers' clothing. So the funnels were heightened in very short order. And it wasn't just the aesthetics that were an advancement. You can see here this bulbous bow. This was the first time that this really had been employed in a major passenger liner. And its function was to improve hydrodynamic efficiency so that you could maintain speed at reduced horsepower. With her cruiser stern, as opposed to the more conventional counter stern that we had seen in other liners, you begin to see a modern design emerge. The Bremen made her maiden voyage in 1929 and took the Blue Ribbon, and her sister ship, the Europa, debuted in 1930. She had been delayed by a shipyard fire. And then she took it from the Bremen, and over the next 3 years, the two of them traded it back and forth. The Bremen's interior was defined by modernism, by the beauty of form, the purity of line, and the superior craftsmanship of materials, as her designers were wont to say. And you can see how this translated in the design of the main salon. The Europa was more traditional, more classical influences, but not overly ornate, and this is her corresponding main salon. In the 1930s, the Italians wanted to attract Americans and their dollars to Italy, so they introduced two ships, the Rex and the Conte de Savoia. The Rex made her maiden voyage in 1933 and soon took the Blue Ribbon with a speed of 29 knots. And they were distinguished. The Rex had a counter stern, the Conte de Savoia had a cruiser stern. Also, their interiors. The Rex reflected Italian villas and palazzos, whereas the Conte de Savoia was much more modern in her appointments, except for this. To me, this is a visual cacophony that is so dizzyingly chaotic, I think I'd be seasick even if it were on land. This is the Galleria Colonna, and it's an anachronism in an otherwise modern ship, but it was said it was a concession to some of the more conservative members of the Italian line directorate. Excuse me. And now we come to the Normandy, probably the most celebrated ocean liner of all times. And if the Leviathan could have a 6-volume biography, then I think the story of the Normandy could fill an entire set of encyclopedias. Her naval architect was a Russian emigre named Vladimir Yorkovich. And you can see that she exhibited the bulbous bow, which was a concept that he actually had developed, along with this very flared hull, which improved both hydrodynamic and aerodynamic efficiency. She also employed, at the time, innovative turboelectric engines. Now, she has a profile that's very sleek, and you'll notice that each of these funnels is rigged and shorter than the one preceding it, so it conveys an idea of speed. She and the Queen Mary vied for the blue ribbon. Eventually, the Queen Mary won out by just a fraction of a knot. So, for all intents and purposes, they achieved the same speed. But the Normandy was able to do it at 160,000 horsepower as compared to the Queen Mary's 212,000 horsepower. And she had absolutely magnificent Art Deco interiors. She had split funnel uptakes, which meant that coming from the boiler room, the vents came up the side of the ship and then converged up at the boat deck into the funnels, so that this enabled a large longitudinal sweep, virtually the length of the ship. And here you can see the magnificent Grand Lounge heading aft here to the equally magnificent smoking room, heading further aft here to this staircase leading up to the grill restaurant. And this statue, La Normandie, once graced the Hotel Fontainebleau in Miami. Her first-class dining room was said to be longer than the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles, and it was a place to see and be seen. Of course, with all the emphasis and space dedicated to first class, second and third class spaces were bound to suffer a bit. But I think that the second class dining room is rather elegant and a little bit more comfortable than the imposing grandeur of the first class restaurant. And the third class restaurant wouldn't seem out of place on second class in some of our earlier liners. And despite having her promenade tucked way aft, third class space still had room for shuffleboard and ping pong. The Great Depression caused work stoppages for both the Normandy and the Queen Mary. Normandy came first in 1935, the Queen Mary followed in 1936. Both required government subsidies, but a condition of the government subsidy for the Queen Mary was the Cunard and White Star merge. And for several years, their ships traveled under dual house flags, but by the 1960s, White Star had been completely absorbed in Cunard and disappeared from history as a shipping line. She was known as the stateliest ship. She had none of the technological advances or the decor of the Normandy. But despite her conservative appearance, she was very popular with crew and passengers alike. The Normandy was admired. The Queen Mary was loved. She had an undefinable charisma that just endeared her to the world. But at the beginning, not everybody was excited about her. Her designer was Arthur Davis. Remember, he designed the Aquitania, and he tried to walk a fine line between modernism and traditionalism. And you can see that there is a lot of polished wood. There was a lot of marquetry in the design, and this is her main hall and shopping arcade. Her first-class dining room had this big mural up here that could track her progress across the Atlantic and later would track the progress of both the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. This is her first-class observation lounge, which would become, in some form or another, a staple on all future queens. Her first-class smoking room extended up through 2 decks. Some found it comfortable, some found it rather cold. But just about everybody was perplexed by Cunard's choice of paintings, Edward Wadsworth's At Sea and Dressed Overall at Quay. In 1936, the Queen Elizabeth was laid down. But by 1940, with just the barest of plumbing and electrical systems installed, she was ordered across the Atlantic under absolute secrecy and made a rather hazardous maiden voyage because she was a major target for the Luftwaffe and for the German Navy. She made it to New York. She was outfitted as a troop ship, and this is a scene that would never be repeated in peacetime. The Second Mauretania, the Normandy, the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth. Even the old Aquitania was pressed into service as a troop ship, the only major liner to serve in both world wars. Churchill said that the Queen shortened the war by a year. Both of them could take thousands of troops anywhere in the world that they were needed, and the Elizabeth once carried 16,000 troops in one voyage. Both ships routinely carried 14,000. February 9th, 1942, an errant spark from a welder's torch engulfed the Normandy and turned her into an inferno. She was being outfitted for war service. The next day, she capsized in New York Harbor, never to sail again. She wasn't the only victim. The Bremen, the Rex, the Conte de Savoia, and the Paris wouldn't survive the war. The Europa did, but only under the French flag as Liberté. The Queen Elizabeth made her first commercial voyage in October of 1946 after already having steamed 500,000 miles. She was a bridge between the 30s and a post-war optimism. She never achieved the same level of affection as the Queen Mary, which to me is kind of a shame because I think in many ways she was a more elegant and graceful ship. This is her first-class dining room. This is her observation lounge, her first-class grand salon. And this is a publicity photo. Can anybody recognize the mile model? How many people are James Bond fans? That's Roger Moore. This is her tourist class lounge and her third class lounge. 1958 saw 1.2 million people cross the Atlantic in these ships. But it was also the debut of the Boeing 707, and I know that's a DC-8 in the picture. But in 1959, 1.5 million traveled by jet, and only a fraction of that by ocean liner. Everybody could see the writing on the wall except Cunard, who declared that the jet was merely a passing phase. We'll take a step back a little bit. The Leviathan had been taken out of service around 1935, and the United States had no presence on the Atlantic to speak of. Some minor second-class liners, but not a major liner, not a ship of state, certainly. So in 1950, the keel of the United States was laid, again with a heavy government subsidy, and again being built to naval specifications so that she could be converted to a troop ship in 48 hours if necessary. But what a marvel. She was designed by William Francis Gibbs. He was a lawyer by training, but a self-taught naval architect by sheer determination. And just think about that. he created the fastest passenger liner that will ever likely sail the ocean. She achieved 38 knots on her trials and would affectionately be known as the Big Ship. On her maiden voyage in July 1952, she shattered the blue ribbon with a speed of 35.6 knots. The British magazine Punch said, "After all the loud and fantastic claims made in advance about the new liner United States, it comes as something of a disappointment to find they're all true." She was built to naval specifications, which meant that she did not have wide open spaces. William Francis Gibbs was also obsessive about fireproofing the ship, so that limited choices of materials. For him, passengers were a mere inconvenience. The ship was the thing. But despite all that, she did have a rather Spartan charm to her design. William Francis was determined that this was going to be a 3-class ship, even though the coming trend was towards 2 classes. And this is her 2nd-class dining room. And this is the 3rd-class dining room. Now, on other lines, of course, forays in between classes was somewhat discouraged. But on the United States, they were absolutely forbidden. Which is kind of interesting that an American ship would have such a rigid class structure. This is her 1st-class Navajo lounge with sand art inspired by Native Americans. The cabin class Harlequin lounge. And this is her swimming pool. It was supposed to be open to 1st, 2nd, and 3rd class, but somehow those tourist class hours were never really posted. The signal flags spell out, "Come on in, the water's fine." In the 1950s, the Italians again wanted to establish their presence, and so they had 2 beautiful ships, the Cristoforo Colombo and the Andrea Doria. And this is the 1st-class dining salon of the Andrea Doria. But on July 25th, 1956, just before midnight, she was rammed by the Swedish-American liner Stockholm and sank the next afternoon off the coast of Nantucket with a loss of 51 lives. The Dutch had always had a significant presence on the North Atlantic, but in 1959 they introduced a rather innovative ship, the Rotterdam. Her design dispensed with traditional funnels, instead had these thin twin uptakes. But despite that, she has a very, very pretty profile. And she was innovative on the inside, too. She was a 2-class ship. And up until now, when you were looking at class divisions, 1st class occupied the middle of the ship with the other 2 classes fore and aft in a vertical separation. With these 2 classes, it was decided that there would be horizontal separation, so each class would have its own deck alternating. And this staircase was designed so that 1st and 2nd class passengers would never meet each other on the stairs. It was patterned after the double helix staircase at the Chateau Chambord in France, designed by Leonardo da Vinci. And our dining room here is somewhat reminiscent to me of the Ile-de-France. And this is her 1st-class Ritz-Carlton lounge. The Ile-de-France and the Liberté were tired. And in the late 50s, France wanted their one last ship of state and a successor to the Normandy. So in 1957, the keel of the France was laid, and she was launched in May of 1960 by Madame de Gaulle. Here you can see a very fine, knife-like prow, and a little bit more sleek than the Normandy, but reminiscent of her design, and with a classic ocean liner profile. She too had distinctive funnels. Those wings were supposed to convey smoke and soot up and away from the decks, but internal memos indicated they didn't always work that way. as a successor to the Normandy, she had an impossible standard to live up to. And also emerging from the 1950s industrial zeitgeist, her decor was bound to disappoint, but it had somewhat of an antiseptic appeal. This is her first-class main salon. But if there was any room on the ship that deserved the criticism, it was this one, the tourist class lounge. Even to an 11-year-old me, this looked like a generic motel lobby we were all trying to escape on land. But her first-class smoking room was magnificent. It extended up through 2 decks, and when she was later converted to the cruise ship Norway, this was one of 2 rooms that was left untouched. The second was the first-class restaurant. The New York Times food critic Craig Claiborne declared that she was the finest French restaurant in the world, which, of course, to the French meant it was the finest restaurant in the world. Even her second-class restaurant provided magnificent cuisine with complimentary bottles of red and white wine at lunch and dinner. The first-class swimming pool was in the bowels of the ship. The second-class swimming pool was covered by a great glass dome, which was great for transatlantic crossings, but when she was pressed into cruising service later in life, cruising in the tropics made this oppressively steamy and humid. Now, this Cabaret Atlantique, a first-class restroom, had a wicked little secret, because there was a staircase behind the shops on the deck below. Late at night, tourist-class passengers could actually come up and enjoy late-night soirees and mingle with first-class passengers. For some reason, in the mid-'60s, the Italians thought they could make a go with 2 new liners. Now, the Michelangelo and the Raffaello were beautiful ships, but they were doomed to failure. They lasted less than a decade. And remember how I said that the North Atlantic was the most dangerous route? 1966, the Michelangelo met a rogue wave, killed 2 passengers and 1 crewman. 1967, the Queen Mary was withdrawn. In 1968, the Queen Elizabeth followed. So in 1969, Cunard had what many thought would be their last grasp of transatlantic glory with the QE2. She was determined to dispense with the past. They even eschewed the traditional funnel livery that Cunard was famous for, red-orange with black bands. Her pre-maiden voyage brochure proclaimed ships had been boring long enough. But she had an interior design that reflected the swinging London 60s style, but didn't seem dated. This is her lookout bar, her version of the observation lounge, which unfortunately was sacrificed to galleys in a 1972 refit for the newly installed Queen's and Princess Grille's restaurant. It was never replicated. This is the midships lobby, the main entrance to the ship on sailing day, but was a very comfortable space mid-ocean for relaxing and reading. The entrance to her first-class dining room on the quarterdeck bifurcated aft to 2 of the most charming alleyways, I think, on any ship. On the starboard side, the midships lobby, or the midships bar, and on the port side, the library and bookstore. Originally, she was going to be a 3-class ship. So this deck would be the first-class lounge. This deck would be the second-class lounge. But when it was decided that she would actually only have 2 classes, her designer, Dennis Lemon, took an eraser and eliminated a portion of that upper deck and included this curved stairway to make the charming double room. It lost some of its allure in later iterations when it was converted to the Grand Lounge, but no one could ever doubt her seaworthiness. And she even was pressed into service during the Falklands War. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Cunard had a series of owners, some good, some nearly disastrous. But by 1999, Carnival Corporation had spent $6 million to acquire Cunard in full, and then almost immediately spent nearly that amount to design and build the current ocean liner, Queen Mary II. With classic ocean liner lines, she also employs technological advances. She has diesel-electric propulsion pods rather than a traditional shafted screw and rudder to both propel and steer her. And she has a design reminiscent of the QE2, if you recall that other bow-on view. She has clean, uncluttered open decks. She has reminders of London streets with a hydrant and a street lamp for special passengers. This is her iconic funnel. They've gone back to the red and black banding. Her main lobby reflecting classic ocean liner style. This is her main restaurant, the Britannia restaurant, dominated by a magnificent tapestry. And this is the Queen's Grove restaurant, reserved for passengers occupying the most exclusive and expensive cabins and staterooms. Her late-night discotheque, the G32, and her version of the observation lounge, the Commodore Club. Of course, shipping lines loved publicity photos of celebrities. Cary Grant and Marlena Dietrich on the Normandy. Clark Gable on the Queen Elizabeth. Our Queen Elizabeth on the Queen Elizabeth. Alfred Hitchcock on the France. And one of the creepiest celebrity photos, Bob Hope leering at Loretta Young. And then there are these two. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were very loyal Queen Mary passengers until they weren't. Cunard finally got up with their insistence on paying minimum third-class fare while occupying the most expensive first-class suite along with 50-odd pieces of luggage. And when Cunard finally put their foot down, for some reason, the United States line was more than willing to subsidize their semi-annual trips across the Atlantic, and they became loyal United States passengers until the ship was withdrawn from service. This is Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr in the QE2. And while these next two may not be the most famous, I think they're the cutest. My son Keith, my daughter Abigail on the QE2. Thank you so much, and I hope you always have fair winds and following seas.
That was wonderful. We have time for just a couple of questions, so if you raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you. We'll go back here.
You mentioned two ships, and one was the Rex, and then there was another one at the same time.
Yes, that was the Conte de Savoia.
Right, and you said something was different about the hulls. What was that? Or the way they were constructed?
Oh, yeah, the difference, you could distinguish the two because the Rex had a counter stern and the Conte de Savoia had a cruiser stern.
What's the difference?
See if I can.
I don't speak boat.
Not many people do. Let me see if I can get back to them.
One is round like this, and the other one is sloped backwards.
Here we go. Yeah, so this is a counter stern here. So it kind of curves back on itself.
All right.
And then this is a cruiser stern that is probably better illustrated right here. As you can see, it's more of a curved, more modern design.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, how fast is 35 knots? Miles per hour fast?
41.
41?
Yeah, conversion factor is 1.15 land miles per hour per knot.
And because of that, would you just briefly go through the power of the earliest ones on up to the electrical? I kind of got lost in there. What were the power?
Well,
How were they powered?
oh, how were they powered? Okay, the Lusitania was powered by steam turbine engines. The Titanic was powered by steam reciprocating engines, which would be somewhat analogous to an internal combustion engine with pistons going up and down. The Normandy was a turbo-electric engine, so it was assisted by electricity, and most ships today are diesel-electric engines. Sure.
You mentioned the United States, but I think you showed I don't know if I'm correct here, but you may have showed a picture of its the earlier smaller version of it, the America, correct?
The America and the United States looked very much the same, but the pictures I showed were of the United States.
Okay, I was just
Yeah.
yeah.
I was actually on the Brennan you just had up there. When did they phase out the crow's nests, and what was the function of all the lines and the masts that were that were out?
I think they probably. Oh, it'll be back. I think they probably phased out the crow's nest as radar and sonar became more integrated, so that they didn't need to rely as much on physical lookouts. And a lot of the wiring that you see, some of it's structural to hold the funnels and the masts. Others served as antennas for radio communication.
I have a question. This might not. So when the steam engines, like the steam turbines, if they I don't think they could use salt water because that would corrode the pipes and cause problems with high pressure steam. Then how did they did they just carry all the water with that and stuff?
Yes, they did. They would also have condensers if there was any, so that they could somewhat distill some of the water, so that it wouldn't. Yeah.
To get to desalinate.
Yeah. Yeah. There were various mechanisms. Yes.
This will be our last question.
Might you know what happened to the Sitmar line?
The Sitmar line, I don't know specifically. Like many of those smaller lines, they were phased out. Some of them survived as cruise lines, but a lot of them get absorbed by some of the more corporate conglomerates. And if I may, one more story. There was a family that went on board the France. It was the first time that they had ever traveled on a transatlantic crossing. And they were traveling first class, and of course, first class, you can order anything, whether it's on the menu or off the menu. And they were presented with the menus. Now, those menus were both in French and English, but even, French food doesn't always translate well to English. And there's also just an amazing choice, numerous dishes that you can look at, and they were just completely baffled by what to order. Well, the people in the next table obviously were seasoned travelers. And when the dining steward came over to that table, he said, "Monsieur, what will you have tonight for dinner?" And the gentleman pulled out a stack of index cards. He goes, "This is what we'll have tonight, and this is what we'll have for lunch tomorrow and dinner for the remainder of the voyage." He had it all planned out. So when the dining steward came over to the rookie travelers and said, "Monsieur, what will you have for dinner tonight?" And he looked over at the other table and he goes, "We'll have what they're having." Excellent choice, monsieur. Thank you very much.